I have one question. So I've never read any Belloc, but recently I read a essay by Henry David Thoreau called Civil Disobedience.
Yeah.
And it seems like maybe Belloc was influenced by him. If that's true, could you expound on that a little bit?
Well, that I would not. If he was influenced by Thoreau, I would be shocked. Thoreau was among the New England transcendentalists, the closest thing to a pantheist you could probably find in the early 19th century. No, I've never been a fan of Walden's Pond. Walden's Pond was just a hop, skip, and a jump away from Boston. It really wasn't a worthwhile rural property anyway. But then again, I don't know very much about New England. Why would you when you know about the South? I'm going to get in trouble. Y'all don't start shooting and throwing tomatoes yet.
No, you're okay.
Yes, thank you so much for coming tonight. My question has to deal with what is to be done in the society with those that do not crave freedom, with those who have no inclination towards independence, with those who have no inclination towards self-sufficiency. How in society are we to structure our society around freedom and individualism with a large subset of those who have no desires to those ends?
The best thing you could do is be an example. And that's what we've tried to do, my wife and my family. We had a beautiful historic home in South Carolina. But we didn't have enough land to do everything that I wanted to do and to really supply a large amount of food. But it's not simply about producing food, although I think it does have a great deal to do with it. I relocated my family to Kentucky so that we could have a larger property away from people who didn't think like we did. So do what you can at home with a wife and your children on a piece of land. There's been several arguments made that when Chesterton and Belloc were thinking about distributism, they didn't have several hundred acres of land in mind. They had maybe 3 to 5 acres of land in mind. And you can lead by example far more effectively than you can lead by simply talking. Action speaks louder than words in that regard. Yes, ma'am.
First, I just want to say your accent is like really cool. Okay.
Well,
is that real? Like, it's great. But I just wanted to, to the last question's point, wouldn't the state of private property in America be more of the aberration historically? Because throughout all of history, whether it's in slavery or serfdom or feudalism or whatever, most people did not have private property in that sense. Perhaps they had like a small patch of land, but they were tenant farmers on the aristocrat or the nobility or the landowner's land. The average person was not necessarily the private property owner. So I guess how realistic is it to return to private property when maybe, I don't know, I'm not the historian here, but I don't know if that's like what's truly historically true for everybody.
Well, Belloc said that the High Middle Ages was the period in English history particularly when a large distribution of private property was to be found, before the advent of the large country estates, before the Protestant Reformation. So I would simply point you to the first 2 or 3 chapters of the Servile State. Belloc gives a wonderful history lesson, as a matter of fact, explaining that during the period basically from the 1200s to the 1400s, there was, in fact, wide distribution of private property in England, which is the country that he's primarily concerned with. He talks about actual slavery itself. Belloc goes into a history lesson about the institution of slavery. He said, yes, it was very rampant during the period of the Roman Empire, but because of Christendom, it waned into almost non-existent status in Europe. He's not talking about the United States.
Thank you very much. I don't want to be a naysayer, but you talk about private property and owning some land, but we own land at the largesse of the government. And if I don't pay taxes on my property, well, the government will simply come in and take it. Or if the government needs my property for something else, they'll simply take it from me. So what exactly is private property? And is it then something that I have to be able to defend from other and prevent other people from using and me using force in order to do that? I mean, what do we mean by private property? Does the government determine what constitutes my property, or does the natural law or God's providence determine it?
Well, I'll just take you back to Belloc. Belloc was very adamant that the right to private property is an inherent right. It is a right. It's not something that can be taken away by government. I am entirely with you. If I had to pay no property taxes, that would be wonderful. But there's very little that can be done about that outside of the voting populace. Although there are some states that do not have property tax. Tennessee's one of them. And if I had bought my farm just a few miles south, I wouldn't have property tax. But then you got to pay tax on your automobiles. You've got to pay tax on just about everything, including oxygen. So I am no fan. I am a strong believer in federalism. I think that American government is way, way too big and too powerful. And you do have a right to defend your property against anybody else using it. Otherwise, it's not private and it's not your property.
I just want you to feel more comfortable amongst these foreign Michiganders. So I'll just let you know, first of all, that we're only sitting here this evening, an hour south of Mecosta, Michigan,
Yes.
where Russell Kirk lived, who was considered himself, he said to Wendell Berry that he was a northern agrarian.
Yeah, he
and
did.
before he died, he got to host Clanth Brooks up at Mecosta.
Right.
And then we're also sitting just about 2 hours north of the Hoosier writer and publisher Jeremy Beer, who's responsible for that edition of Who Owns America that you have in your possession there, which is, of course, one of the best books ever published. One question, going back to the one right there, is that we just heard a second ago, is I got to read a few years ago the recovered manuscript of Ransom's Land with an exclamation point. And, you know, the thesis there is that if there were more subsistence farmers, they would just be outside of the tax. They'd be outside of the taxable world. They'd be outside of the market economy. And alas, that just doesn't seem like the most compelling argument for, you might say, the practicality of the distributive principles. So if you were put on the spot, what's the strongest argument against a naysayer for why the owning of private property is essential to human beings?
I'll say that they have fallen prey to the very problem that Belloc and Chesterton outlined, that you don't even have the ability to think outside of the box that you have inherited. You think this is the way it's supposed to be, that that everything is okay if you live in a suburb or an apartment, and you never strive for any land that you can produce some of your own goods from. Most people don't think about this anymore. It's a mentality. It is an entire way of thought that has to be recovered because it's been relegated to the dustbins of history. When you say subsistence farming or homesteading or anything of that nature, I have many thoughts about that. Many people think that they want to be farmers, they want to grow something, and the first summer that patio tomato plant dies, they give it up. Farming's hard work, but it's rewarding work. From my earliest childhood, one of my first and most powerful dreams was to simply be a farmer. And if I didn't go to graduate school and end up being put on the spot like this, I'd probably be just happy out in a garden somewhere. And it's not that distributism and agrarianism is trying to restore the Garden of Eden. We know that the Garden of Eden and that all of creation is going to be redeemed eventually. But we still live in a fallen world. One of the cardinal points here is that working land, everybody doesn't have to do it, but it should be honored and respected. It should not be denigrated as of less importance than a professional job or a career that requires 2 or 3 degrees. It must be respected. And Ransom said this in the introductory statement of principles to I'll Take My Stand. Said that we don't expect everybody to simply go back to the land. And they said we don't want to restore the 1860s Confederacy. We don't want to go back to the 19th century. And so one of the common charges among distributism and agrarianism is that this is no more than whimsical nostalgia, that it serves no actual practical purpose. I think that if it serves the purpose of helping people see a different perspective, it maybe serves as a stepping stone back across the turbulent thing that's called the 20th century, then it's worthwhile. It's worthwhile. This is not a practical back to the land self-help book. This is trying to get distributism and agrarianism. These people are trying to get others to rethink how they perceive work and labor and leisure.
Are you saying that it can look different in different places today?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Could you give a couple examples? And then he has a question.
You mean different examples of these ideas, practically speaking. I went to Ireland a few years ago, and I know that the Catholic Church is dwindling in Ireland these days. But the one thing that struck me there was its lack of industry, and the fact that people took their time when eating a meal, when enjoying a conversation, when singing a song, when enjoying a beer. They were not rushed, they were not hurried. It was very much a slow-paced lifestyle, at least in the rural parts of Ireland that I saw. And it can be found in those small places where you have people who have just enough in common where they're willing to work together to get a job done. And no, I would not look to the Amish as the proper example for this. I think the Amish have some very terrible religious ideas. And so unfortunately, that's where the practical, most of the time when you speak of these type of topics, that's the practical example that people go to, is the Amish community. It doesn't have to look like that. You don't have to ride in a buggy, although it does look pretty cool.
Thank you very much for coming out tonight. I just had a quick question. What advice do you have for young folks who are currently in that wage worker state and hope to one day move to owning private property? What would you say is a good roadmap to success there? Because success, as you said, is not defined by how much money you make, but how would you map that out?
Well, don't go into debt. Save as much money as you can. Marry a woman that shares your vision, and start small. Start small. Your first property that you buy will more than likely not be the final property that you buy. One of the reasons we were able to buy the farm that we have now is because it's our third property. We built equity. I'm not an economist, but I know enough to tell you that if you start small, there's nothing wrong with that. And just know that if you're interested in working for yourself, you don't have to have a farm business. You can be just one of the overarching themes here is people need to learn and to want to be more responsible for how they make their livelihood, to have more control over it. And that can take a myriad of forms. There was one of Wendell Berry's friends, was called the Contrary Farmer, Gene Logston from down in Ohio. I'm finally in a part of the country where I have to say down in Ohio. And he wrote a book in the 90s called The Contrary Farmer. And I wish more people would read it. That would be an excellent, excellent topic for a lecture in and of itself, because he's talking to people who have the same question you do. And he says one of the worst things you can do is go to a modern college and get a degree if you want to have control over your livelihood. Because what's going on now is more and more young people are going into debt for degrees that are fairly well useless. They're not learning anything. you can learn just as much, if not more, by building a private library as you can going to college in 2024 America. And so that's where many young people are shooting themselves in the foot, and they're not able to get a leg up in the world, is because they're starting out in debt because of student loans. I have many other thoughts on that subject, but we can talk privately.
Thanks for your talk. Just one quick question. Do you know, did Belloc, or perhaps any Southern agrarian, interact with the ideas of Thomas Robert Malthus, namely his claim that agricultural produce would grow at an arithmetic rate while the population would inevitably grow at a geometric rate?
I have no idea. No idea. That is way above my pay grade. I am educated beyond my intelligence.
I think why a lot of people are going to homesteading is because after COVID, a lot of us have realized that we're wage slaves and our employer has too much control over us. And one of the best ways is to be able to provide for ourselves.
Yeah.
But what we're discovering is we're in a prison that has, and there's a financial prison, right? So even if we've got money put away, like say in 401k, we can't really access it without getting hit with a giant tax bill. We've got the property taxes. You know, those of us who are trying to think outside of the box or to get out of the prison, they've done a really good job at cornering us, especially financially. So have you put any thought into some creative ways to get out of it?
Ooh, that's a naughty question.
Not a naughty, but I mean, it's a legitimate question. I mean,
It is a legitimate question. We can't talk about that. Something I know exactly what you're saying. There is a bureaucracy that we fight against every day. There is a financial bureaucracy, and people need to study the Austrian School of Economics with a little bit more seriousness. I don't know if anybody's familiar here with the Austrian School of Economics, Ludwig von Mises. They're headquartered in Auburn, Alabama, and there are far too many libertarians among them for my taste, because just as Russell Kirk argued, there are good reasons not to be a libertarian. But they do have some good economic ideas, and so that's where I would point people initially, is study the Austrian School of Economics. Because those people are frustrated with the federal government's control over our national economy. And it's not simply the federal government. State and local governments can be just as aggravating as Washington can. I despise having to go to the local county courthouse and write them a check, a sizable check, for property tax, vehicle tax. And you're right. Back to the gentleman's point that asked about property taxes a while ago. You don't pay your property tax, the government's going to take your land, going to auction it off. It shouldn't be that way. When the Constitution was ratified, there was no such thing as income tax. Income tax is another thing that just aggravates me. It wasn't until this period that the United States passes an income tax amendment to the Constitution. During the first 2 or 3 generations after the ratification of the Constitution in 1787, the only real form of taxation that the federal government had access to was tariffs on imported goods. Why can't we just go back to that? Trump did, and it worked for a while. You raise the tariff high enough to where the federal government's going to make money off of it, and that creates a massive amount of income. If they need money, there's other ways to do it other than, well, it's just legalized theft, in my particular opinion. So yes, I've known many people farmers, homesteaders, and there are some exemptions in different states, but for the most part, you, my dear lady, are exactly right. And the only way that I know to really solve that is a grassroots movement. It won't happen from the top down.
We got time for 2 more questions. I got one here and one over here.
Thank you, sir, for recommending Wilhelm Röpke's A Humane Economy. Appreciate you. The question that I have is, it seems to me, perhaps you can correct me if I'm wrong, that much of this stems from a desire to remain a child, not to take on responsibility, not to... Our litigious society is directly structured against responsibility.
Yes.
Right? It's risk aversion, and Ron, the smartest people in the room, yes, question. How do we model for society a contrary to the very core of safety and security, and today is going to be much like yesterday as tomorrow will be, so we don't have to fret because there are no saber-toothed tigers in suits or in fur coming through the front doors.
Yeah. Well, you're right. We are dealing with a disease of perpetual childhood in American society. And it really is a disease. People just don't want to grow up. I mean, everybody probably knows somebody in your family, you have friends, they just never grew up. But that's a societal problem at the same time. I think that the church itself offers the greatest example. I think that we have a wonderful example in these encyclicals. The church is, one thing that really shocked me when I started to read the catechism and the literary history, this beautiful literary history within Catholicism. It really is true that there's nothing new under the sun. This is not the first society where we've had to deal with the disease of perpetual childhood. It's happened before. So I think that if we were to look to the past and look to the church is already setting that example. Because, Jesus tells us that we have to basically man up and follow him. It's not easy. He didn't promise us a bed of roses. We have this weak-kneed, self-centered, strip mall Christianity in this country now. It's not strong. I mean, Genghis Khan once said, I would be heavily persuaded to be a Christian if I ever actually met one. We don't have the luxury of simply sitting on the sidelines and allowing our society to be taken over by secular humanists. The church is there. Personal holiness. Live a life of personal holiness in front of everybody around you, and it will draw attention. It will definitely draw attention because people can't stand it. Woo, you want to make somebody mad. But I have to go back to that because I love the quote from Fulton Sheen. Personal holiness is just absolutely important. Regardless as to whether you're a farmer or a property owner or whatever. There is a limit to how much we can talk about this. There are things that are more important, which is essentially living a life of personal holiness. But it all kind of connects at the end of the day. Yes, sir. One more question you said?
Yes. In Servile State, Belloc focuses on England appropriately, so it's where he's writing from, and I've recently become more familiar with a similar phenomenon up north, which is the Highland clearances. Was this just an inevitable outgrowth of the Protestant revolt, that people's view of ownership and their relationship to land changed because their theology changed, or was it just coincident?
I don't think it was coincidence at all. I don't think there are any coincidences. I think that the Protestant Reformation was, from the beginning, intensely futuristic and presentist. It became less and less interested with historical consciousness and matters of history. I mean, you know what many people have said. I think Cardinal Newman said it, that to study history is to cease to be Protestant. I love that quote. But I do think that several things are going on in the 16th century. Not only the Protestant Reformation, you've got the Renaissance, the rise of humanism, and Romanticism, and just all these isms and ologies. Essentially, mankind is starting to see the world from as himself being the center of it, rather than any type of religion. And the Protestant Reformation, unfortunately, helped unleash this futuristic, self-centered worldview, which ends up moving into the Enlightenment. This is a big, big historical narrative you're talking about of the past 500 years. But it's a good question, and I don't think it's coincidence. I think that the Protestant Reformation has done more damage than perhaps many people have thought about. It's created damage.